If you shoot with an enthusiast level or professional level Canon DSLR, and it could be a full frame camera or even an APS-C camera, you're probably going to have a pretty advanced menu system like the one that you're looking at right now. So let's go over these settings to understand what each of these menu settings do. Now I'm using the Canon 5DS, but if you're using any other camera, you might have items buried in different locations. Now I'm shooting with the Canon 5DS, which is a full frame camera, but if you're shooting with any other camera, you might actually have less or more options. Let's go ahead and go through each menu item one at a time. So the first one we've got here is image quality. And under image quality, we have the chance here to select between RAW and JPEG. And this is a very important setting. That's why it's the first in every Canon DSLR. So here we have the ability to choose between different RAW options. We've got full-size RAW, medium RAW, and SRAW. Now, I've written an article on why you should not be shooting with medium or small. So my preference is to always shoot RAW. And as far as JPEG, if I rotate the other dial on the back of the camera, you can see that I can basically choose to not have anything, which would just shoot RAW, or I can choose between different sizes of JPEG images from large to medium 1 and medium 2, and I can choose between different quality levels. So my preference is not to shoot JPEG, but if you shoot JPEG and you're scared to process RAW images, my recommendation would be to shoot RAW and JPEG high. So this would be the best setting to choose. Anyway, I'm just going to go to RAW by itself. So that's the first option. Next, we have image review. Now, image review is something that basically after every time you take a picture, it will show you for a specific amount of time. In this case, I can turn it off or set it to 8 seconds or to even hold. It will show me images after I capture them. So I usually keep this turned off. And the reason why I do that, one, I do not want to waste the battery. And two, I do not want to be chimping as I take pictures because I want to concentrate on my photography instead. But if you prefer to have that, you can actually set a specific timer, 2 seconds or 4 seconds or longer. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn that off. Beep is something that I don't even know why Canon makes this default, because it's really annoying. Every time when you're going to be focusing, it's going to beep. So I always turn this off. Next, we have release shutter without card. And this one, basically, if you do not have a memory card inserted, the camera will fire. And the default behavior is to do that. Now, the worst thing that can happen is if you're shooting something important and you forgot to put a memory card and your camera is shooting, you make the assumption that the memory card is there. And obviously, if you discover that later, it's too late. So I always disable that. Next, we have the corrections. And Canon has a few corrections. There is peripheral illumination, which is basically vignetting. And then you have chromatic aberration. Now, something to keep in mind that right now for this lens, you can see on the very top, there is correction data available. Basically, with different firmware, Canon provides correction information, and you can do both vignetting and chromatic aberration corrections. I honestly turn these off. And the reason why I do that, because it only impacts JPEG images. Since I shoot RAW, it doesn't matter. So I go ahead and go back here now. And the last menu here is the external speed light control. And if you're shooting with external speed lights, there's a bunch of options here for you to go through. So as you can see right now, it says menu cannot be displayed, incompatible flash, or flash power is turned off. That's because I do not have anything connected. But there's a bunch of settings in here that you can go through. And if you use flash, this is where you would go. Next, we have the shoot to submenu, and we have a bunch of options here. First, we've got the exposure compensation / bracketing. Now here, if I'm going to move or rotate the top dial, it allows me to set bracketing. And as you can see, I can go in 1/3 increments to say 1 stops, 2 stops, and the maximum is 3 stops apart. Now, if I go to the middle, it disables bracketing. And if I rotate the rear dial, the large dial, I can go ahead and change the exposure compensation. Well, I really don't do that through the menu because by default, the rear dial on Canon DSLRs already does the exposure compensation, so it really doesn't matter. I'm just going to go ahead and set it to 0. Next, we have ISO speed settings. And from here, it's actually a really good menu for you to be able to select the auto ISO setting. So as you can see right now, the default behavior is to do auto ISO. With auto ISO, basically the camera detects what shutter speed you're shooting with. So if you have, say, a 50mm lens, it will use the reciprocal rule and keep your shutter speed at minimum of that focal length. So for example, with a 50mm lens, it's going to be 1/50th of a second. With longer lenses, it's going to try to keep that shutter speed at least the same level. So here we have the ability to go auto, or I can manually set ISO. So if I want to go ISO 100 and not give the ability to choose auto ISO, here's where I can do that from. And just rotating the rear dial will allow me to go from ISO 100 all the way to ISO 6400. Now, if I wanted to enable the auto ISO option, I have the second submenu here, which allows me to choose the ISO speed range. And I could say the minimum ISO that I want to be able to choose is ISO 100 and the maximum is 6400. For an APS-C camera, I choose usually ISO 1600, maybe ISO 3200. For full frame, I usually leave it at ISO 6400. Now we have another menu option here, which is ISO speed range, and as you saw here, I have the ability to choose up to ISO 6400, but 12,000 is grayed out. And that's because there is another setting for me to be able to choose the speed range that I can choose from. So I could say, well, the minimum is ISO 100, but the maximum should be, say, ISO 1600. If I do that, now if I go back here, you can see that I can only choose up to ISO 1600. Now, or if I said, well, I want to be able to choose between all the ISOs, I can set it to 12,000, and now I can choose up to ISO 12,000. Now, the next setting is the one that controls the auto ISO range. And right now, if I set it to auto, and I come in here, I can do the same thing and say, well, if I want my auto ISO to go as high as, say, ISO 3200, this is where I set it from, or say, well, I'm comfortable with 6400, I'm just going to do that and click OK. Now, when the camera tries to change the ISO automatically, depending on what focal length I'm shooting at to keep up with the reciprocal rule, it's going to allow me to basically set the camera to up to ISO 6400. Now, if I don't like the noise level there, and if I want to go, say, ISO 3200 maximum, this is where I do that from. Now, the minimum shutter speed is a really cool option, and the nice thing about this feature is that the default auto option sets the camera to set the minimum shutter speed to match the reciprocal rule. So by default right now, you can see that it's set to 0. So if I'm shooting, say, with a 50mm lens, the camera will try to keep that shutter speed at minimum of 1/50th of a second. But if I have shaky hands and I say, well, you know what, that 1/50th of a second is not enough, then I can actually push it higher. So here it basically doubles it to 1/100th of a second using that 50mm lens, or here it's 200th of a second, and this is 1/400th of a second. But if you have very stable hands, or maybe you're relying on that image stabilization, you can actually lower it to -1, -2, and -3. So just keep that in mind. Now, if you're a wildlife photographer, you might not want to do this, and you might instead want to go manual. Now, by going manual, you're basically telling the camera, well, I do not want that shutter speed to fluctuate. Maybe you're using a zoom lens, something like a 200 to 400mm lens. Well, in that environment, you do not want that shutter speed to fluctuate. And what you want to do here is you actually can go in and manually set your shutter speed. And this basically sets the minimum shutter speed. The camera will try to keep that minimum shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second once I set it. And it can go up, but it cannot go down. And once it reaches the threshold, say if your maximum allowable ISO is 6400, if the light levels drop to the level where it cannot keep up, then it will drop the shutter speed below that value. All right, so I'm just going to keep it at auto, and that mid section works for me. But again, if you have shaky hands, just push it up and you should be good to go. So that's all there is to know about ISO speed settings. Let's go back. Next, we have Auto Lighting Optimizer. Now here, you have the ability to choose between different auto lighting optimizer levels. You've got high, standard, and low. Now, I keep this turned off, and the reason why I do that is because it doesn't matter for raw images. All it's doing is basically applying a curves to the image, just like you do in Photoshop, and I don't want that. Next, we've got white balance, and with white balance, the default behavior is auto white balance, which is where I keep my white balance settings at, because again, with raw images, it doesn't matter. But if you wanted to, you could go through these different presets, or you could set your color temperature manually. All right, so we're just going to keep this at auto white balance. Next, there's custom white balance. Now, what this does is if you have a white balance card or like a gray card, you can actually take a picture of it and use that card. If I click set now, it will say use white balance data from this image for custom white balance, and I could do that and the white balance will be set. So I don't mess with this unless I really want to set the white balance for my JPEG images. And like I said, white balance settings don't matter for RAW, but if you shoot JPEG or you shoot RAW plus JPEG and you want that white balance to be perfect, these are the settings that you go through. Next, we have white balance shift with bracketing. Now, if you want to bracket your white balance, or perhaps you want to fine tune it, this is where you do it from. I personally don't mess with this. The last option here is Colorspace, and you have two options, sRGB or Adobe RGB. Now, if you're a JPEG shooter, it's best to keep it at sRGB. I only shoot RAW, so I keep mine at Adobe RGB. And the reason why I do that is because Adobe RGB has more colors, and it gives me a more accurate histogram. Next, we have Shoot 3 submenu, and the first option here is picture style. So all of this doesn't really matter, but if you really want to change the look of the LCD screen on the back, or if you shoot JPEG, this would affect the images. For RAW shooters, doesn't matter. So I keep mine at standard. Now, one thing to keep in mind is you can actually press the info button and fine tune it further. So from here, I can set different levels of sharpness. I can change my contrast, saturation, and all that. Again, doesn't really matter. So I just keep everything at default. So let's go back. Now we have long exposure noise reduction, and by default, as you can see, it's actually turned off. Now what this does is it actually does impact RAW images. If you shoot images longer than say 15 or 30 seconds, what will happen is the sensor will start heating up, and that process actually creates noise. Now, if you do shoot really long exposures, it's best to keep this turned on. And the reason why is because if you don't have it turned on, you end up with all that noise. If you do turn it on, what happens is the camera will first capture your image, and then it will take another image as a reference photo, then subtract that noise information from the first image. So you will end up with less noise this way. There's another option here with auto, and if you do this, it will automatically know if you shoot really long exposures and noise is being generated, the camera will trigger that. Now, I turn this off by default because what happens is if I do shoot a long exposure, it will actually double the amount of time that the image is being captured. So something to keep in mind, if you do long exposures, you might want to do auto or enable. I personally just do this right before I take those long exposures. Next, we have high ISO speed noise reduction. Now, this is something that only affects JPEG images, and if you shoot JPEG and you have a really high ISO setting, say ISO 6400, the camera will try to reduce the noise. Now, I personally turn this off just because it does not affect your RAW images. As you can see, it says options are limited with RAW or RAW plus JPEG image quality. That's there for that reason. Next, we have highlight tone priority, and what this does is basically the camera will try to recover the highlights in expense of potentially introducing more noise in the shadows. So I basically have this turned off. That's a default behavior, and I recommend you do the same. Next, we have the dust delete data. Now, for this one, you have to use Canon specific software, and all it does is just adds information on where dust is located and embeds it into RAW and JPEG images. And again, you have to use specific software that can use that information. I personally do not use this. I would rather keep my sensor clean physically. Next, we've got multiple exposure, and this is for the creatives that like to take multiple shots and combine them together in one image. Now, something to keep in mind, this actually can be done with RAW images. So if I go in here and say I want to turn it on using function control or using continuous shooting mode, then once I turn it on, I can take multiple images and it will combine them together for cool effects. Here I can set number of exposures, and the maximum number is, it looks like 9 images, which is a lot. I don't know why you would ever do that, but the minimum is 2 exposures. Next, we have HDR mode, and this one I don't use because it only works for JPEG images. So by default, it's turned off, but if you want to try it out, this is where you do it from, and you can select all kinds of different options from here. All right, so we are now in Shoot For menu option. And the first item here is interval timer. Now this one is if you want to set time lapses. So if I enable this, you can see that I can actually make adjustments to it. So I could say, you know what, shoot every 10 seconds, or maybe set to every 3 seconds. And the number of shots, this is where I increase the number. It can go all the way down to unlimited, or I can set a specific number between 1 and 99. So a cool feature to have for those people that enjoy doing time-lapse photography. Next, we have the bulb timer, and right now it's disabled, and if I go in here, it says not available in the current shooting mode, and that's because I'm shooting in aperture priority mode. In order for me to be able to enable that, I would have to switch to the bulb mode on the top of the camera. Now, once I choose the bulb mode, you can see I can enable it, and this is actually a really cool feature to have, because if you shoot exposures longer than 30 seconds, you do not need a special accessory to control that. So from here, I could set my timer to really any length of time, from seconds to minutes to hours, which is really cool. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and turn that off. Next, we have anti-flicker shooting, and this one is actually great to use in indoor situations where you have mercury vapor or some crazy fluorescent lights. If you turn that on, the camera will try to avoid the flickering, and this actually works really well. But as you can see, once I enable this, then it might slow down my continuous shooting. So I would keep it turned off unless you're shooting indoors or maybe shooting outdoors with those crazy lights on. Next is mirror lockup, and here you can basically set different delays up to 2 seconds, or you can configure the camera so that you have to press the shutter release twice for the mirror to go up and start shooting. Now, once you set the delay to say 2 seconds, what will happen is the camera will raise the mirror, wait 2 seconds, and then fire. So this is really cool in those situations where you have maybe a very unstable setup and you want to delay the mirror. All right, from here we go to the crop aspect ratio. Now, as you can see, it's set to full, which means that I'm actually shooting in full resolution. But if I wanted to have a crop, say 1.3x or 1.6x, which is basically the APS-C equivalent, or I want to change the aspect ratio, this is where I do this from. Now, I would just keep it at full frame because that gives me the most resolution. Next, we have Shoot 5 submenu. Here you have the live view shooting. You can enable or disable. Now, there's a dedicated button for live view on this camera, and many other modern cameras will have this option. Now, if you want to disable that option, you can basically do it from here. After you do this, whether you press the start and stop button on the back or not, nothing will happen. Now, I keep this enabled, but if you find yourself accidentally pressing that button and it annoys you, you can turn that off. The AF method by default tracks faces. So here we have face recognition and tracking. And if you're photographing a person and you're autofocusing, the camera will recognize face and track the person's face automatically. If you switch to FlexiZone AF, what that will do is it will disable face recognition and just look at wherever your focus point is set at. Now, keep in mind, we are under the Labview function, so this actually only works in Labview mode. If you turn off Labview, it will not work the same way. And the same goes for continuous autofocusing. So by default, it's disabled, and it's a good thing because if you enable it, your lens will continuously hunt and try to acquire focus. It will try to do that so that if your subject moves, it will not have to go and jump and make really large jumps in focusing. So I keep that disabled by default. Grid display is again something that will turn on or off during live view shooting. Now, the exposure simulation option, what that does is in live view, when you have that turned on, it will try to simulate whatever your final exposure is supposed to look like. Now, you can disable that by going into disable. What that will do then is, even if you have an exposure that is going to look really dark or really bright, it will always try to boost live view. So I do not recommend doing that unless you really shoot in a low light environment and you want to see everything in a really low light environment. That's the only case where you would disable it. Otherwise, just keep it enabled. The next submenu is Shoot 6, and as you can see, it still has to do with Labview Functions. The very first option we have here is Silent Live View Shooting, and there are two options here, Mode 1 and Mode 2. If you're wondering what this is basically where Canon hid its electronic front curtain mode. When you're shooting in Live View mode, if you select Mode 1 or Mode 2, the electronic front curtain mode is going to be enabled. Now what that does is before the exposure, the mirror is already raised because you're in Live View mode, but when you start taking pictures, it doesn't have to raise the actual shutter, which is really nice because you can actually have a completely vibration-free shooting with this mode enabled. Now the difference between Mode 1 and Mode 2 is that in Mode 1 you can shoot continuously. So if you wanted to take multiple shots, you basically squeeze the shutter release and it will take shots in continuous mode. Whereas in Mode 2, it will limit that to only one shot. Now I personally don't shoot continuously in Live View mode. I don't really see reason to do that, so I just do Mode 2 for one image. But this is something you do not want to disable. Now the last option is metering timer. Now this is pretty useless because all it does is when you're in Live View mode and you have pressed the shutter release to see what the exposure is supposed to be, and it will show you where, if it's off or maybe underexposed or overexposed, that's just how long the information will remain active before it disappears. Now we get to autofocus. Now this section can get pretty complex because this camera has one of the most sophisticated Canon autofocus systems out there. So if you're not sure about these settings, I would recommend to do further reading. Let's go through these real quick to see what they do. The first submenu contains different case scenarios. So as you can see, I can navigate through different cases. And the first one is versatile multi-purpose setting for maybe running, and then another one for tracking subjects, ignoring possible obstacles. So there's a bunch of different options that you can pick from. And depending on what type of shooting you do, as you can see, it actually changes the settings on the right bottom side. So go through these, identify which one works best for you, and pick the one that works best. Case 1 is actually the best for me personally for most types of shooting. And if you do specific things like wildlife photography or sports photography where you need specific settings, you might want to play with this. And here you can basically customize different options like tracking sensitivity, acceleration, deceleration tracking, and autofocus point switching. From here we go to the second submenu, and here we have AI servo modes. Now, if you're shooting in AI servo mode, which is basically continuous tracking of subjects, then you can have different types of priorities. So you can do release priority or focus priority. So by default, it's set to equal priority. That works best for most types of shooting. But if you want to say set to focus, what will happen is if you're shooting in continuous mode and your subject is not in focus, the camera will try to first acquire focus before letting you fire that shutter. But if you set it to release, whether the subject is in focus or not, your camera will still fire. This is a good balance between the two. Next, you have the AI servo's second image priority. And this one is a little bit odd and hard to understand, but basically what happens is the first image that you take, if you have, for example, a subject that's running towards you, well, you might want to first have that sharp image, and then maybe you want to prioritize the focus. And then for the second image, maybe you want to say, you know what, I don't care, I just want to have the shooting speed priority. Now what will happen is in the first image, the camera will try to get focus before it starts firing, but once it starts firing for a second and all the subsequent images, it will prioritize whether on focus, equal priority, or speed. If I select speed, it will just shoot at the maximum frame rate. If I choose focus, it will slow down and we'll try to acquire focus first before firing. So that's something important to keep in mind. For me, the best setting is to have both set to equal. But if you are doing sports photography, something more specific, you might want to play with these to see which one works best for you. Now, if submenu 2 is for photographing subjects that are moving, the third one is for single shooting where the subject is not moving. The first option here is lens electronic manual focus. If you have a specific lens that has an electronic manual focus ring, such as the 85mm f1.2L or f1.2L2, then you can set further options here. The first submenu here is enable after one shot AF. Now what will happen is if you have this enabled and you take a picture, you can actually overwrite the autofocus with the manual focus ring. If you disable that after autofocus is acquired, whether you turn the focus ring or not, nothing will happen. And the last option is to disable in AF mode. So you have the switch on the lens that says AF or manual focus. If you have that selected to AF and you do not want to engage manual focus at all, you can completely disable it from here. Now, I would just keep it at the default setting, but if you know what you're doing and you want to further tweak the way that the manual focus engages on those specific lenses, then you can control it from there. Next, we have the AF Assist beam firing. Now, that's the AF Assist lamp in front of the camera. If you're shooting in low light conditions and you don't have enough light, the camera in this one-shot mode will try to fire that beam at your subject to try to engage focus better. So I keep that enabled by default, but if you want to disable it, that's the option right there for you. You also have the option to engage infrared AF Assist beam, but that only is available if you're shooting with a specific speed light. So if you have a speed light that has that, you can enable it from here. By default, I would just keep that on. Next, there is one-shot AF release priority. Now here you can, just like in AI servo mode, specify what to prioritize on. If you want to prioritize on focus, the camera will not fire. But if you just want to fire no matter what, whether your subject is in focus or not, that's where you set this to release. I would just keep it at focus. From here, we go to AF4, and there are a bunch of options here for you to control autofocus behavior. The first one is lens drive when AF impossible. Now with this one, you can basically set it to continuously search for focus, or you can say, well, if the lens cannot acquire focus, it will just stop. So it totally depends on what you're trying to do. I would just keep it at default. Selectable AF point is basically something that you can limit to however many points you want to make available in the camera. So if you want to do only cross-type AF focus points, this is where you set it from, and then you can further tweak it down to all the way down to 9 points. I would keep it at 61 points. The Select AF Area selection mode allows me to basically limit my options when I choose between different focus areas. So if I say, well, I do not want the Spot AF and the Expand AF Area option and this option, then I can limit it here. I would personally just leave it here with all the options checked because I use all of them depending on what I'm doing. So by default, like I said, I'll just leave everything enabled. The AF area selection method basically allows you to select the behavior of how your AF area mode is selected. So the default behavior is to press that button on the back of the camera, and then to toggle between the different AF areas, you would have to press the M function right next to the shutter release. And you can also change that behavior so that you actually have to press that button and change the dial or rotate the dial on the top of the camera. I personally just go with the first option because then I can move the focus points easily, and then if I need to switch, I just press the MFN button. Next is the orientation linked AF point. Now this is actually a cool option to use because if you switch from vertical shooting to horizontal shooting, going from landscape to portrait for example, you can have the camera automatically track that, and if you say photograph a person's face and you want that focus point to change every time when you change orientation, you can do that. It will actually remember it for both horizontal and vertical shooting. Now you can also have another option here, which is to basically remember the AF area together with a point. So if you shoot subject in different modes, you can select that. I personally would go with this option, which is to just remember where the focus point was. This next option is a bit complex and I would just skip it, but if you want to know what it does, basically when you switch from single point to 61 point tracking for continuous shooting, you need to basically set your first initial focus point. So if you have, for example, birds flying towards you and you want to concentrate on the bird that's in the middle of the frame and then track it, this is where you do this from. So the default behavior is auto, but if you want to set it to initial AF point selected, all you have to do is basically, before you switch to this full 61 point tracking, you select whichever point where you want to start from, and then it will track the subject automatically using all those 61 points. I would just keep it at auto. It's easier to use, but if you know what you're doing, if you do wildlife photography and other things like sports photography, you might want to play with the setting and see which one works for you. The last option is basically face recognition. So if you have someone running towards you and you're shooting in continuous mode or maybe single servo mode, as long as you have any of the dynamic modes enabled like zone AF or 61 point automatic selection AF, in those modes the camera will try to focus on the person's face. If you want to disable that, you can do that from here. I would just keep it enabled. Now we're at the last sub menu, and there are 4 options here, so let's talk about those. The first option is manual AF point selection pattern. From here you can basically make your autofocus points stop when they get to the edges, or you can basically use the wraparound method, which as soon as you reach one of the edges, it will start from the other side. I would just stop it because I wouldn't want my focus point to move all the time. Next, we have Viewfinder display illumination. Now here, the default behavior is auto. So if you're shooting in really low light environment and you can't see those autofocus points within the viewfinder, it will show them in red. But in good light conditions, it will not. I personally prefer to see the red illumination every single time. I do not want it to be disabled in good light conditions. So what I do is I set it to enable. And in addition to setting to enable, that's only for the regular shooting. If I want to set it to AI servo AF, where if I'm continuously tracking a subject and see that illumination, I can set that to on here. So that's how I set mine. The last setting here is AF micro adjustment, and that's the one that you do not want to play with unless you know exactly what you're doing. It will allow you to adjust your lenses if they're not focusing properly, but the only way you can do this is you need to have specific methodology using test charts or some other material. So unless, again, you know what you're doing, I would not touch that. The next tab is Playback, and here we have 3 submenus. Now this is the one that I really don't mess with. These first 2 tabs are pretty much useless for me because I can do all this in post-processing later. But if you wanted to do something like change the image jump from 10 frames at a time to maybe 100 images at a time, this is where you can do that from when you rotate that top dial. The one that's really important for me though is this 3rd tab. And here what I do is I always first enable the highlight alert, which is basically turning on the blinkies. Another one that I enable is AF point display. And the reason why is because I do want to see where I was focusing on the subject. Now keep in mind this might not work at all times, but when it does, it actually is not a bad feature to have. It's not very obtrusive. Now I don't care about the playback grid because I have the grid enabled in the viewfinder. But the one that is really cool and absolutely must have is this magnification. Now what will happen by default is when you view an image and you press the zoom button, it will by default magnify to 2x. And what that does is if you want to go and look at 100%, then you have to keep pressing that button and just magnify more and more and more until you get 200%. What I really like is this option right here that says actual size. Now let me show you what that means. So once I pick this up and I go play and look at an image, if I press the zoom button, boom, that's 100%. So instantly I can say, well, maybe this is slightly out of focus and I need to refocus. But if I press that button one more time, it gets out. So this is really neat to have because you can analyze the image, see if you need to refocus, go back and do that. So if I go back to menu now and I change the default behavior, look at what will happen. Now if I press the zoom in button, it only zooms in to this level, and if I wanted to see what's happening at the pixel level, I would have to rotate the top dial so many more times just to get to 100% view. So this saves me a long time for not having to do all this and re-rendering that image every single time. So I'm going to go ahead and go back and keep that at actual size. Actual size, which is basically 100% view. And that's an awesome feature to have, because no matter which image I'm looking at, just pressing that button, instantly you get 100% zoom. Pressing that zoom button one more time gets out of that. So make sure you enable that. From here we go to the setup menu, and there are a few options here that are really important that I want to go over. So the first one here in the first submenu is record function card and folder selection. So the way that this works is basically if you have multiple cards, you can set different options of recording or writing images to those cards. So the first option is standard. Now with the standard, you can basically select where to dump your images, whether it's the CF card or the SD card. And if I switch to auto switch card, what will happen is once the first card fills up, it will start writing to the second memory card. And the third option here, to record separately, allows you to choose different file formats. So for example, if you shoot RAW and JPEG, you could dump your RAW files into the first memory card and your JPEG images into the second one. The last option, to record to multiple, is basically a backup option. So if you're shooting a wedding or something really important and you're afraid to lose files, well, you can basically have the camera write both images or the same image to both cards at the same time. So this is a really good backup option. There's also a way for you to select folders. So you can just select the default folder, or you can create a new folder and start writing images there. The next option is file numbering, and here you have three options: continuous, auto reset, and manual reset. With the continuous one enabled, which is the default behavior, basically it continues from the last number. So if the last number for the image was 1001, it will continue with 1002 once you insert a new memory card. The auto reset option basically resets it whenever you insert a new memory card. So if you had the last sequence number as 1002 and you put in a brand new memory card, it will start from 1. The manual reset allows you to reset the file numbering as you have it right now. So if I click that, now the next image is going to start from 001 on that same memory card. I would just keep it at continuous. Under file name, you have the ability to change the file name. It doesn't really matter for me because once I import images into Lightroom, I rename images anyway, but if you wanted to do that, you can do that from here. Now the auto rotate option is really important because by default what this does is it will actually auto rotate images when you're playing them back, and it will also record the rotation information into the image. Now let me show you what this does. The default behavior for when I press the playback button, if I switch to a vertical image, look at all that wasted space to the left and to the right side of the image. Well, if I'm looking at the LCD is not very large and the image gets even smaller. I don't like that. I would rather change the camera orientation manually rather than looking at images like this. So what I do is I go back to menu and I select the second option. The second option, and I'll explain in a second, by selecting that, now if I look at the image, well, all I have to do is turn the camera sideways and now I can see the whole image. So I'm not wasting any space. But the reason why I chose this option and not off is because basically whenever I change orientation, if I go from horizontal to vertical or from the landscape mode to portrait mode, I still want the camera to remember which orientation I was using and write that information into each image. This way, if I import images into, say, Lightroom, the software will automatically recognize the orientation and change the orientation automatically. If I don't do this, if I select off, what will happen is that once I import images into Lightroom, none of the information was saved into images. I'm going to have to go and manually rotate each one. That would be annoying. It would consume a lot of my time, so this option works the best. The last option here is format card. Now, something to keep in mind, if you are photographing and then just moving images from your memory card into your computer, make sure and format your memory card when you insert it into your camera, because if you don't do that, it could cause corruption. All right, from here we go to the second submenu under Setup. We have Auto Power Off, which basically allows you to select the length of time the camera will show you, say, the menu before it turns off. Now, I have it disabled because for this video, I didn't want to just turn off, but if you wanted to save power, you could just choose 1 minute. I'm going to keep this disabled for now. With LCD brightness, you can basically choose between auto and manual. Now, in auto mode, if you're shooting outside and it's too bright, the camera will try to match the brightness and make it a little bit brighter so you can see the images. And in low light environments, it will try to lower the brightness down. You can switch to manual and you choose different brightness levels. So if you want to conserve battery life, you can just choose one and your LCD will always be really dark. All right, so from here we go to date time zone, and this is something you will see when you just power up the camera for the first time. It will allow you to choose the time zone. It will allow you to choose the year, date, month, so on and so forth. The language menu is for people that maybe want to have menus in different languages, and you can see there are a bunch of options here. Mine is default English. Under Viewfinder display, you will have customization options on how the viewfinder and what type of information is shown in the viewfinder, and I really like this in Canon DSLRs. These latest cameras have a lot of ways you can actually customize it. So if you wanted to have the electronic level always show, you can do that, and you will see it right in the viewfinder. I don't do this one personally, but the grid I always want to have because that allows me to align images properly, align the horizon. It's great for framing. But another one I really like is this show hide and viewfinder option, because from here you can select all kinds of stuff here. So like if you wanted to see what your metering mode is, you can check that. You can check your AF operation, your drive mode, your battery level, all these different things. And if you're in a flicker situation shooting in crazy light, it will actually detect it and show you in the viewfinder, which is really great. Just keep in mind that the more things you add, the busier your viewfinder will be. So if you don't want these options, just disable them and click OK, and you'll be good to go. All right, from here we go to GPS device settings. This camera in particular doesn't have a GPS chip, but if it did, then it would identify it and would give you options to further customize the GPS device settings. All right, under Setup Menu 3, we have a bunch of options. These are, for the most part, just informational. And like video system, for example, if you're in the United States, you choose NTSC. For Europeans and other countries, you might choose PAL. Battery info shows you how much battery you have left in the battery, and then also what your recharge performance is. So if you have a really old battery, you can basically find out from here. Next, we have sensor cleaning, and here you have multiple options. There's a way for you to enable auto cleaning. Now, the auto cleaning and the clean now option, these are only for the micro vibrations that the sensor performs in order to shake off dust that might be sitting on it. If you have dust that is sitting on it and you cannot shake off with that option, you can basically enable the clean manually option. Here, the mirror will lock up and you can access the sensor to clean it. So just keep that in mind. These are for the micro vibrations, and this is for manual sensor cleaning. Next, we have the info button display options. And from here, you can basically customize what's shown when you press the info button on the back of the camera. Now, by default, you have all 4 selected, but I personally don't want to show the display camera settings or the electronic level. I would leave the quick control screen because from there you can make quick adjustments, or even better, if you want to customize the quick control screen, you can do the custom quick control screen. Now let me show you what that would look like. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and I go to custom quick control. This is a really neat feature because it allows you to basically customize the way the screen will look like. So if I wanted to, say, move this aperture, I can just click and move the aperture anywhere I want. If I wanted to move, say, this autofocus point selection, I can just move it around. This is really neat because it allows you to customize that screen. Or if I want to maybe add a few things in these empty boxes here, I can just press the Q button and say I wanted to add the white balance information. That's great. I can just choose one, and right there is auto white balance. So now if I press the info button, you can see that my customized screen is here. That is really cool because from here I can just press Q and change anything I want, including auto white balance settings right here. Look at that. That's pretty awesome. So let's go back to the menu, and whatever you want to do, just you can revert the layout to default, clear all items. So this is a really cool way to edit that info screen. The last option is the rate button function, and here you can basically customize the behavior of the rate button on the back of the camera. So by default, it's going to allow you to adjust the rating for each image, or you can change the behavior so that it becomes protect. By doing that, if you want to protect an image so that you don't accidentally delete it, you can change that behavior from here. I just set mine to rating, which is a default. Okay, from here we go to the last submenu, and you have a bunch more options here. You have custom shooting mode, C1 through C3, and this is a really neat feature because what it allows me to do is set different shooting modes for different environments. So for example, if I wanted to have one shooting mode for, say, landscape photography, where I have one set of features and camera menu options, and maybe another one for portraiture, this is where I do this from. And check this out, it says register camera settings to custom shooting mode C1. If I click OK now, it just saved everything that I've done into that option. Now, if I go back and say, no, I'm gonna go ahead and change my, say, autofocus options and set something here, maybe I change it to case 2. If I go back to that option, which is right here, and say I register it under C2 and save it, now if I select C1 from the top of the camera, check this out. In this C1 setting, if I go back to the menu and navigate back to my AF, you can see it's case 1. And if I select C2, go back to that same setting, look at that, it's case 2. So this is really neat, and I wish Nikon did this on all of their DSLRs because there's a really easy way for you to set certain profiles that you can easily navigate through, register. Once you register it, you can't mess up, even if you end up changing it, unless you come back here and re-register it or clear it, nothing will change. So this is great for those situations when you want to switch from one type of shooting to another, say from portrait photography to landscape photography. You don't have to go through all these menu settings to make modifications. From here we go to clear all camera settings. Now if I press this, right now it will not allow me to clear it because I am in C, one of the C modes. But if I go back to, say, aperture priority, and I go back here and say clear all camera settings, it will say, do you want to do this? If I click OK, everything that I've done so far will be wiped out. So if you did something and you're not sure what you did and you just want to reset everything, that's where you do it from. The copyright information is something that will be basically embedded into each image as you capture it. You can enter your own name, which is the author's name. You can enter your copyright details, maybe provide your website information or your contact information. So you can do all that from here. Next, we have certification logo display. I don't know why you would ever want to do this, but if you want to see the certification logos, they're found here. The last option is firmware version, and you can see that there's two types of firmware, one for camera, one for lens. And if you go to Canon's website, you can actually see what the latest firmware is for your camera, and you can download it from there. Now, the lens one is for lens profiles. So for things like chromatic aberration correction or vignetting correction, you would have to download the latest version of the lens firmware. Let's go back. And I would obviously recommend to keep up with the firmware. So if you find something newer, go ahead and update that camera. It's pretty safe. From here, we go to camera functions, and we have 4 submenus here. The first one is camera function 1, which is exposure. And these are the things that I normally would not mess with because you can really change the behavior of the camera. So like the exposure level increments, default is 1/3 of a stop. Same with ISO speed. If you want to make modifications, you can go to maybe half a stop. I don't know why you would want to do that, but these are the ways you can customize that. Now, the number of bracketed shots is something that you might want to use if you do, say, HDR photography, because you can change from, say, 3 shots, which is a default behavior, to something like 7 shots. Now, if you remember when we were here before, it only allowed me to do 3 shots, but look at that. I can space them out, and that gives me a total of 7 images. So if you want to go crazy with your bracketing options, this is where you would do that from. So let me go back to where I was, and I'm just going to set it back to the default 3 shots. Now, the safety shift option, I personally have it disabled. I don't know why you would want to enable it, but if you're shooting, say, in shutter priority mode, and if the light conditions change drastically, the camera in shutter priority mode would end up with a darker image. By enabling, say, the shutter speed / aperture option, the camera will overwrite that chosen shutter speed and try to match good exposure. I don't know why, again, you would do that. I would just keep it disabled. Now, this last option, same exposure for new aperture, can actually be pretty neat. Say you're shooting in manual mode and you have an f2 lens. At f2, maybe you set your shutter speed to 1/100th of a second. Now, if you suddenly change your lens to an f2.8 lens, what will happen is you're going to have to readjust the exposure. Well, if I go here and set this to shutter speed, what will happen is if I change from that f2 lens at 1/100th of a second to an f2.8 lens, my camera, although I'm shooting in manual mode, it will automatically adjust my shutter speed to 1/50th of a second. That's really cool. So if you find yourself switching lenses all the time and you shoot in manual mode, you do not have to go back and forth. This could be actually pretty useful for even wildlife or sports photography when you rely on extenders. So if you use a 1.4x extender or maybe 2.0x extender, this will automatically modify even your manual mode. From here, we go to the second tab, which is also camera function. And we've got 2 options here. We have set shutter speed range. And from here, you can basically limit how high you can go as far as your shutter speed is concerned. So the high speed on this camera is 1/8000th of a second. But if I said, well, I don't want that, I want that to be 1/4000th of a second, I can change that from here. The same thing for low speed. I can actually go down if I do not want to have that 1/32nd option. Then we have the set aperture range. Same thing, you can see that the minimum aperture, and that's a lot, obviously with only lenses that will allow you to go all the way to f91. I've never seen a lens that can do that. But if you say, you know what, I never want to go beyond f11, you could do that from here. So I don't know why I would want to change this, but if you want to do that, you can do that from here. And the maximum aperture is the same way. So if you want to limit your maximum aperture, this is where you would do that from. The third submenu is called Others, and we have a bunch of options here. The first one is Warnings in the Viewfinder. Now, if you have things like monochrome set as the picture profile and you have white balance correction, or maybe you have noise reduction set, when you look through the viewfinder, you will see an exclamation mark on the very bottom right corner of the viewfinder. So if you don't want to see that, you can actually uncheck and disable those. But you could even do, for example, spot meter. That just warns you that you have spot metering turned on. If you just want to get a warning when you have spot metering, then you can enable that. Next, we have the dial direction during the aperture priority and shutter priority modes. So when you're in one of those, if you want to reverse the direction, this is where you do that from. Maybe you're coming from a different camera system and you had it differently. Next, you have the multifunction lock. And from here, basically there is a button on the very bottom of the camera on the back. You can see right under that large dial, it's called lock. Well, that lock behavior can be customized. So if you lock it, it will lock the main dial. If you choose this option, it will lock the quick control dial. And the last option is to lock the multi-controller joystick. Now, you can obviously select all 3, and if you do that, locking will lock all 3. I'm going to go back to the default behavior. I rarely ever use that lock anyway, but that's where you could do that from. The next option, custom controls, is really important because from here you can modify the behavior of buttons, including your shutter release. So for example, if you want to do focus and your recompose method, by default, the camera is set to do metering and AF start, which means if you have pressed the shutter release, it will actually first focus, and then when you depress the shutter release, it will fire. Well, if you didn't want that, if you wanted to move focusing to the dedicated AF on button on the back of the camera, you could set this to metering start. By doing that, if I have pressed the shutter release, it will now only start the metering. It will not actually trigger the change in autofocus. And right here you can see that the AF on right now is configured to do metering and AF start, which is exactly what this was set to earlier. So if I wanted to do the focus and recompose technique, I would configure the shutter release to do just the metering start, or you can also choose AE lock and keep the AF on at metering and AF start. From here, you can customize the behavior of other buttons. Like the star, for example, I can choose any of these functions that are available, and I can do the same thing for the buttons on the front, like the depth of field preview, or maybe the button on the lens if there is one. And you can also change the behavior of the multi-function button. By default, there is no function. So if you're just shooting and pressing that set button, it achieves nothing. But what you could do is set this to magnification and reduction, basically the same zoom button you have on the left of the camera. So from here, if I press the play button and press the set button now on the back of the camera, now you can see it's the same thing as pressing the zoom button on the left of the camera. So if I press set one more time, I'm back to full view. All right, so let's go back here, and there are a few other things that you can modify. Just go through this, see what works for you. Personally, I really like this setting because I'm a Nikon shooter, and whenever I shoot with the Canon DSLR, I really like setting this to zoom, and then also I switch the half pressing autofocus to the dedicated AF on button. All right, from here we go to add cropping information. And what you can do here is you can just basically specify different types of aspect ratios, and you can go crazy from anything from like 6:6 to 10:12, all these weird aspect ratios. The add cropping information option basically allows you to select different crop options, and if you want to do anything other than standard, you choose that from here, and what it will do, it will actually allow you to preserve that information. It will still record it in full resolution, but it will preserve it in the image so that you can use Canon software to then, which will automatically crop that image for you. And one more thing to add to that is choosing any of these will actually add lines in live view. So if you want to see what you're doing, then choosing an aspect ratio of say 6:6 will actually show you in the live view. Now the default erase option is basically for situations where you play back an image and you want to delete it. You say maybe it's not the right one, or maybe it's blurry. Well, if you press the delete button on the back of the camera, you can see that the default action is cancel. The only way you can actually erase the image, you have to navigate to the right, then press the set button, and that's when it will delete the image. Well, if I want to change that, I can actually select erase selected. Now what happens is if I again press playback and I want to delete, as you can see, it defaults to erase. This might save time when you want to delete images so that you don't have to go through one image at a time and navigate to the right, then press erase. Now this option is for lenses that have the ability to automatically retract. Now if I turn the camera off, the default behavior is to basically retract those lenses, but I can disable that and it will not retract. The last submenu is clear all custom functions. Now, as you can see, this is actually different than the one that we've seen in the setup menu. There's clear all camera settings. Well, clearing all camera settings will clear everything except for the custom functions. And this is something really important because if you make changes to the custom functions, you might not want to wipe them out when you go to the previous clear settings. So this will actually have two places where you can save information and two places where you can clear it out. At the very end, we have the last tab, and it's for setting up your own custom menu. And this is another great feature to have, because if you have specific things that you often access, this is where you do this from. So I can click on Add My Menu tab. And by doing that, now I have a Configure My Menu 1 option. So I click there and I can say Select Items to Register. And I can go through all these different options to go from. So say I want to do the button function there, and I say register this to this tab and click OK. Now the button function option is there. If I go back, look at that, button function. So this is something to keep in mind. If you want to add more things, you just go to configure and you just keep on adding things that you want to add. And now we have another tab. So if you want to add more, maybe for different things that you do, this is where you do that from. So if I wanted to add another tab, maybe with different settings, all I have to do is press that again and it says Add My Menu tab 2 and click OK. And now look at that. I have 1, 2. So you can have different settings for different tabs, which is really neat. Now something we haven't talked about yet, which is also very important. If you go to the very first menu right here under Labview Functions, these Labview Functions are specific to one mode, which is camera shooting mode. If I were to go ahead and switch to movie shooting mode, which is basically a dial on the back of the camera, now you notice that the last two tabs actually have to do with movies. My Labview options are gone. So if you're wondering where to find your movie options, this is how you do it. First, you have to switch the Labview mode to movie on the back of the camera. Then only you can press the menu button to access these options. But since we're mainly discussing photography and not videography, I'm going to go ahead and skip this entire section. All right, well, that's basically it as far as the menu settings are concerned. As you can see, there are a lot of different settings, and hopefully this will make it easier for you to understand how your camera operates, and hopefully you don't have to go and fiddle with the camera manual to be able to get the best out of your camera. These are the settings that I use on Canon DSLRs every time when I use them, so they work for me, and hopefully they will work for you the same way.